All right. Excuse me there. What's up, PT on Ice Daily Crew? Dr. Mark Gallant here, coming at you on Clinical Tuesday from the Ice Extremity Management Division alongside Lindsay Huey and Eric Chacones. Want to talk today about TFCC injuries. They're one of those injuries that pretty common in our gymnasts, our weightlifting sports, and one of those ones that always seem to be a bit of a bugger to treat in clinics. So really want to dive in today on how do we reduce pain in these folks, how do we get them back active, and ultimately how do we get them back to their level of sport or activity they want to participate in. Before we dive into that, a couple courses coming up. I'm going to be in Hendersonville, Tennessee. So hanging out with the folks at Onward Tennessee. A lot of ICE faculty going to be there. Zach and Alexis Morning, Jesse, Cody Gingrich. So if you've been looking to take extremity management and you want to parlay that into a nice little vacation, head over to Music City, get some hot chicken. That would be a great opportunity to hang out with all of us. I'm sure with Zach and Alexis in the building, there's going to be some neck cracking and some talk of pelvic health. So a really nice comprehensive weekend. If you're unable to come to that one, Lindsay's going to be out in Grass Valley, California at the end of June, and I'll be in Rome, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta at the end of June. So like Cody said a few weeks ago, a couple opportunities to catch us in the middle of the country in Tennessee, West Coast with Grass Valley, East Coast in Rome, Georgia. So talking about TFCC injuries. So the triangular fibrocartilage complex, it is the area of the ulnar side of the wrist that is most common to generate pain and to have injuries in an athletic population. There are all sorts of structures that make up that triangular fibrocartilage complex. So we won't dive too much into them. What they function as, they serve as a stabilizer of the wrist. They serve to handle compressive loads. So they cushion compressive loads that are coming through the wrist, especially when the wrist is extended. And they also transmit force from the carpals to the ulna. So what we're going to see a lot of times with these injuries is oftentimes your fall on an outstretched arm can be a mechanism of injury. Now that CrossFit and weightlifting have gained so much popularity, what we often see is folks go to catch that clean, they get stuck in the bottom of the hole, they get jammed up, their elbow smacks their knee, the bar puts a extension force on the wrist, and we can also see triangular fibrocartilage complex injuries from that mechanism. And then the classic one are those folks that spend a ton of time in loaded wrist extension. So think about our gymnasts who are always walking on their hands, doing push-ups, doing presses. These are the folks that are often gonna walk into your clinic and have some pain in that triangular fibrocartilage complex area. How you're going to detect that that's the area, they're going to point to the ulnar side of their wrist. If you palpate that nice little soft spot right there, just distal to the ulna, that's oftentimes going to be painful. They're going to have pain with that loaded extension. So if you have them press out of a chair or do a push-up, that's often a good indication that that TFCC is involved. Loaded ulnar deviation and then putting them into a stretch of radial deviation will also provoke those symptoms. So that's how you're going to figure out that this is indeed someone who has a TFCC injury. So again, someone who does an activity that would indicate that gymnastics, weightlifting, fall on outstretched arm, pain with compressive loads into extension, ulnar deviation, radial deviation, palpation to the ulnar side of the wrist. So how are we going to treat these folks out? So one of the first steps often in these sort of injuries is we want to put out the fire. We need to decrease the amount of symptoms they're having, and we want to decrease the amount of force and load early on that's going through that wrist so that we can calm things down a little bit. There's a couple ways we can do this. First is using a widget splint. So you can find these at any Walgreens, CVS, drugstore. It's a splint that has a little bit of a gap over the carpals. That will help unload the wrist when it's in wrist extension. If you're someone who's in the CrossFit or the weightlifting space, some traditional wrist wraps can often help take the wrist out of that compressive moment, give them a little reprieve from being in full extension. So either a widget splint or wrist wraps are going to be a nice way to decrease that pain early on. We want to avoid depending on those things forever, but early on to get them out of pain, to keep them relatively moving, these can be a really nice start. The other thing we're going to look at is modifying their activities. So anytime we can, we want to keep people as fit as possible. We don't want to totally pull them out of their sport, out of their functional activities. We know what those things do for people's sense of well-being, for their mental health. So we want to keep them as involved as we can. So taking that extension load off the wrist. So having them do push-ups in more of a neutral grip here, switching them to dumbbell presses instead of barbell presses. That'll help keep the wrist in more of a neutral position. If they want to rock a bunch of push-ups, they can do those on dumbbells where their wrist can stay in more of a neutral position. Or as we're working back into that extension, putting towels under the proximal hand so that you can control the volume of wrist extension that they go into and then progress them increasingly back towards that. So that's how we're going to decrease the overall symptoms and keep them moving. We're going to use wrist wraps, widget splints, and using more of a neutral grip position when we're doing our pressing activities. How are we going to start increasing load to the wrists to move these tissues forward? We know to get tissues to improve their health, research of Karim Khan, mechanotransduction, we have to get some productive load into these structures, these tendons, ligaments, muscles that surround the wrist. There's a few different ways that we're gonna prioritize loading the wrist early. The first is loading pronation. The pronator quadratus has a bunch of impact on the overall stability of the distal radial ulnar joint. And oftentimes people can tolerate this one quite well early on. So it's a really nice go-to in your early TFCC treatment. So however you want to rock that loaded pronation, one of the best ways we found, getting a hammer or one of those dumbbells that's got a lopsided weight, and you can load that up there, or taking a band, attaching a weight to it so that you can do that full range resisted pronation. Again, that's going to help increase the overall stability of the distal radial ulnar joint by activating the pronator quadratus. The second muscle we want to go after is the extensor carpi ulnaris. The extensor carpi ulnaris is literally part of the triangular fibrocartilage complex. So it would behoove us to go after that muscle. Now, we know we're unable to isolate specific muscles. So we're going to use wrist extension to get after the extensor carpi ulnaris. So the big thing here is the exercise is not the most important factor. It's the dosage that you're going to do. So traditional wrist extension with a dumbbell, a band, either one is going to work great here. We want to make sure we're dosing this appropriately. What we call the rehab dosage, 8 to 20 repetitions at 30 to 80% of that person's 1 rep max. Early on, that person's not going to be able to tolerate a lot of tensile load through their wrist. So you're going to go lower on that 1 rep max scale, closer to 30%, getting them up higher towards that 20 reps. So we still have a lot of time under tension, but less load that's not going to be as uncomfortable for that person. And then as they get stronger, as their symptoms decrease, we're going to progress them higher intensity, heavier load, and now progressing down to that 3 sets of 10, 4 sets of 8, more into that range. So we've got for local loading, pronator quadratus, loaded pronation in the rehab dose, extensor carpi ulnaris with wrist extension in that rehab dose. The third piece to your local loading is going to be the dart thrower's motion. So the dart thrower's motion is, if my wrist was thumb here, I'm going to turn so that first knuckle is towards the ceiling. So when I extend, I'm in a slight radial deviation. And when I flex, I'm in a slight ulnar deviation. This is a movement pattern that is very common to the wrist. There's a lot of functional activities in our life that use that dart thrower's motion of the wrist in that slightly radial deviated extended plane, flexed and ulnar deviated plane. So getting this back and restoring this motion into a pain-free and resilient motion really does a lot for the sensory motor properties of that TFCC. So it's another area that we want to make sure we get after early and often. Same idea, using that rehab dose, whether you want to use cables, resistance band, weights to get into that dart thrower's motion, making sure we're loading that early on. So To recap, we've got step 1, make sure that we're protecting the tissue, getting it to calm down. Step 2, loading the local tissues so we can build more resilience to the local TFCC area using loaded pronation, loaded extension, and a loaded dart throwers motion. And then we want to start restoring overall function. At ICE, our favorite way to do that for the wrist and hand is a loaded carry. There's 2 variations that we love for TFCC. The first one is a bottoms up kettlebell carry. When you hold that kettlebell in the bottoms up position, it's going to demand a lot of activation of both the dorsal and palmar side wrist and forearm structures. So those muscles are going to be working really hard to provide stability of the wrist. It is a wonderful first line treatment for these TFCC injuries. Oftentimes people can tolerate them quite well because that wrist is in a nice neutral position. It's a really nice way to get a good functional load through the upper quarter early on. From there, we're going to progress into a server's carry. So you're holding a plate or any object up like this, like a server. You're going to start with a lighter weight. Maybe you're using your 10-pound plate, your 15-pound plate, whatever level of compression and wrist extension that person can tolerate. And then you're going to keep loading that using your 45-pound plates, getting them as heavy as possible that they can tolerate into that wrist extension compression. We like to use 3 rounds of 50 to 100 feet is a really nice stimulus early on. So those 2 carries are going to be really beneficial. First, bottoms up carry with a kettlebell, and then going into that server's carry to get them progressing in their tolerance to wrist extension and compression. From there, once they're tolerating that, how fit will you let me get you? What functional activity do you want to get back into? Do we need to start progressing push-ups? Do we need to start progressing our overhead press? Do we need to start progressing our wall walks and our handstands? The sky is the limit depending on what that person wants. So again, TFCC injuries, they can take a long time to heal. They can seem like a bit of a scary thing to treat in clinic. Focus on the basic principles. Put out the fire using your widgets, your wrist wraps, putting the wrist into more of a neutral position to calm things down. Load the essential local tissues, pronation, wrist extension, dart throwers motion, using your loaded carries to begin to restore function, starting with that bottoms up carry, progressing into the server's carry, and then whatever the activity that person needs to get back to, try to get them back there and beyond. Hope this helps. Hope you will have a great rest of your Tuesday in clinic. Can't wait to see you out on the road here. Hope to see a lot of you in Hendersonville, Tennessee next week. If not, we'll catch you in Grass Valley, California or Rome, Georgia. Have a great rest of your day.